I was standing in my front yard at 7:30 in the morning on a Saturday in October, watching Tony from Colorado Springs Irrigation Service hook up his massive air compressor to my sprinkler system, when I noticed her marching across the street like a woman on a mission. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular pitch that makes your teeth hurt. "Excuse me, sir." I turned around, already knowing this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. The woman approaching was probably in her mid-50s, wearing a purple velour tracksuit that looked like it cost more than my monthly car payment, and carrying a clipboard. In Lakewood, Colorado, where I had just bought my first home 3 months ago, a clipboard in the hands of a concerned-looking woman meant only one thing: HOA trouble. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice friendly despite the sinking feeling in my gut. "I'm Barbara Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, stopping a few feet away and looking at Tony's truck with obvious disapproval. "And I need to know what exactly you think you're doing here." I glanced at Tony, who was pretending to be very interested in his equipment while clearly listening to every word. "I'm getting my sprinkler system winterized," I said. "It's October, and we're supposed to get freezing temperatures next week. I don't want the pipes to burst." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "And did you submit a request form for this maintenance work?" "A request form," I repeated, genuinely confused. "It's routine maintenance. The guy who sold me the house said I needed to do it every year before winter." Section 14, Paragraph C of the HOA bylaws clearly states that any contracted work performed on a property within the community requires advance notification and approval, Barbara said, tapping her clipboard with a manicured fingernail. "That includes landscaping maintenance." Tony finally spoke up. "Madam, if he doesn't get this done before the hard freeze, he's looking at thousands of dollars in repairs. Burst pipes, damaged sprinkler heads, the works." Barbara's expression didn't change. "Then he should have planned ahead and submitted the proper paperwork." "How long is this going to take?" "About 45 minutes, Tony said. "Maybe an hour." "And how loud is it going to be?" Tony and I exchanged glances. "Well, the compressor's not exactly quiet," Tony admitted, "but it's just compressed air blowing through the system. It's not like we're jackhammering concrete." Barbara pulled out her phone and took several pictures of Tony's truck, the compressor, and me standing there looking increasingly annoyed. "This is your first warning, Mr. Ortega. Logan Ortega. Mr. Ortega. Any future violations will result in fines. And if this noise disturbance continues beyond reasonable limits, you'll be hearing from the HOA board." She turned on her heel and marched back across the street to her house, which I now noticed had a perfect lawn, perfectly trimmed hedges, and probably a perfectly organized garage where she kept all her perfectly filed HOA violation notices. "Wow," Tony said, watching her go. "She seems fun at parties." "I didn't even know we had an HOA," I muttered. "I mean, I knew technically, but nobody said anything about it when I bought the place. The seller never mentioned any of this stuff." "You didn't raid the CC and Artiques?" Tony asked, starting up the compressor. "I skimmed them. There was like 200 pages of legal text." The compressor roared to life, effectively ending our conversation. For the next hour, I watched Tony work his way through my 8 sprinkler zones, the compressor letting out loud bursts of air as it forced all the water out of the underground pipes. Each zone made a distinctive whooshing sound as the water shot out of the sprinkler heads, followed by the continued rumble of the compressor. It was loud, sure, but it was 9 in the morning on a Saturday. People were mowing lawns, kids were playing in yards, someone down the street was using a leaf blower. It seemed like a perfectly reasonable time to do yard maintenance. except, apparently, to Barbara Patterson. I noticed her standing in her window, phone in hand, clearly recording the whole process. When the third zone started up with a particularly loud burst, she came back outside, this time with an actual decibel meter. "Are you serious right now?" I called out over the noise. She held up the meter, showing me a reading of 85 decibels. Section 22, paragraph F. No noise exceeding 75 decibels between the hours of 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. on weekends. It's a compressor. What do you want me to do? Ask it politely to be quieter. Tony shut off the machine for a moment. "Look, lady, I've got 4 more zones to do. This is standard winterization procedure. Every house in this neighborhood should be doing the same thing." "I already had mine done 2 weeks ago," Barbara said smugly. "Between the hours of 1 and 3 p.m. on a Wednesday, when most people are at work and the noise wouldn't disturb anyone. And I filed the proper paperwork 7 days in advance, as required." "I work during the week," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "That's why I scheduled this for Saturday morning, like a normal person." "Then you should have taken time off work," Barbara replied. "The rules apply to everyone equally, Mr. Ortega. That's what makes a community function properly." Tony looked at me, and I could see he was calculating whether this job was worth the hassle. "Look, man, I can come back another day if you want, but like I said, we're running out of time before the freeze." I took a deep breath. "No, finish the job. If she wants to find me, let her try." Barbara's face lit up like I had just given her a Christmas present. "I have all the evidence I need right here," she said, waving her phone. "You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation within 72 hours, along with the associated fine of $250 for unpermitted work and an additional $100 for the noise violation." $350, I nearly shouted. "For winterizing my sprinklers, for violating clearly established community standards," Barbara corrected. "If you had simply followed the proper procedure, none of this would have been necessary." She turned and walked away again, and I noticed several of my neighbors had come out to watch the show. Great. I had been in this house for 3 months and was already the neighborhood problem child. Tony finished the remaining zones as quickly as he could, and I paid him in cash, adding an extra $20 for having to deal with Barbara. "Good luck with all that," he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of her house. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and HOA presidents are the worst. They've got nothing better to do than make everyone else miserable." After he left, I went inside and actually sat down to read through the HOA bylaws that I had admittedly blown off during the home buying process. The document was a nightmare of bureaucratic language and petty rules. No basketball hoops visible from the street. No parking in your driveway overnight unless the vehicle was in an enclosed garage. No holiday decorations before November 15th or after January 7th. No garden gnomes, pink flamingos, or whimsical outdoor decor without written approval. The list went on, and buried in there was, indeed, the requirement to submit a request form for any contracted work at least 7 business days in advance. I called my real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Kim who had assured me this was a quiet, friendly neighborhood with almost no HOA drama. "Oh, hey Logan," she answered. "How's the new house?" "Kim, you said there was no HOA drama." There was a pause. "Is there drama?" "The president just threatened to fine me $350 for winterizing my sprinklers." Another pause, longer this time. "For winterizing your sprinklers." Apparently, I needed to file paperwork a week in advance, and the compressor was too loud. Kim sighed. "Okay, so here's the thing. When I sold you the house, old management was still running the HOA. They were super relaxed, barely did anything. But there was an election in August and Barbara Patterson took over. She's been aggressive with enforcement. You could have mentioned that. I honestly didn't know it would be this bad. Look, you have options. You can pay the fine and file the proper paperwork next time, or you can appeal to the HOA board. There's a hearing process. A hearing for winterizing my sprinklers. I know it sounds ridiculous, but if you don't want to pay the fine, that's your option. The board meets once a month. You'd need to submit your appeal in writing, and they'd schedule you for the next available meeting. I thanked Kim and hung up, feeling my blood pressure rising. $350 for protecting my home from winter damage. It was insane, but paying it felt like admitting I had done something wrong. The violation notice arrived exactly 72 hours later, delivered by certified mail. It included detailed photos of Tony's truck, timestamps, and the decibel readings Barbara had taken. There was even a neighbor statement from a guy named Harold Chen who lived next door to Barbara, saying the noise had disturbed his morning peace and quiet. I had met Harold exactly once, when he had come over to inform me that my trash cans were supposed to be hidden from street view at all times, not just on trash day. The notice gave me 14 days to either pay the fine or submit a written appeal. I spent that evening drafting what I hoped was a professional, reasonable explanation of the situation. I pointed out that winterizing sprinkler systems was essential maintenance, not optional cosmetic work. I noted that the work had been done during normal business hours on a weekend morning, when outdoor noise was expected and common. I included documentation from Tony's company showing that 45 minutes to an hour was the standard time frame for this service, and that compressor noise levels were industry standard for this type of work. I submitted the appeal on day 13, hand-delivering it to the HOA management office located in a small building at the entrance to our subdivision. The woman at the desk, a tired-looking lady in her 60s, accepted my envelope with a sympathetic smile. "Barbara again?" she asked. "How did you know? You're the fourth appeal this month. She's been very thorough since taking over." She stamped my envelope with a received date. "The board meets on the second Tuesday of every month. You should get a notice about when your hearing is scheduled." 2 weeks later, I received a formal notification that my hearing was set for November 14th at 7 p.m. at the community center. I was given 15 minutes to present my case, after which the board would deliberate and issue a decision within 10 business days. The night of the hearing, I showed up at the community center 15 minutes early with a folder full of documentation. My appeal letter, Tony's invoice, photos showing that several other houses in the neighborhood had clearly had similar work done recently, and a printed-out section of Colorado state law regarding reasonable property maintenance. The community center was a bland rectangular building with beige walls and industrial carpet. About 20 other people were already there, sitting in folding chairs facing a table where 5 board members sat. Barbara was in the center, naturally, looking official and severe in a black blazer. To her left was Harold Chen, which explained his statement against me. The other 3 members were people I didn't recognize. A middle-aged man in a polo shirt, an elderly woman with white hair, and a younger woman who looked extremely bored to be there. Barbara called the meeting to order and worked through several items of old business, including approving new paint colors for 2 houses, both variations of beige, and discussing the replacement of dead shrubs in the common areas. Finally, she got to my case. "Appeal number 22-47, she announced. "Logan Ortega, 1847 Maple Ridge Drive, appealing violations for unpermitted contracted work and excessive noise. Mr. Ortega, you have 15 minutes. I stood up and walked to the front, feeling like I was on trial for murder instead of getting my sprinklers winterized. Thank you. I'm appealing the $350 fine I received for having my sprinkler system winterized on October 21st. I wasn't aware of the requirement to file advance paperwork for routine maintenance, and the work was done during normal hours on a weekend morning when outdoor maintenance noise is common and expected. I walked them through my documentation, explaining each point clearly. Several people in the audience were nodding along. The man in the polo shirt looked sympathetic. Even the bored young woman seemed to be paying attention. Barbara, however, looked unmoved. When I finished, she consulted her notes and said, "Mr. Ortega, ignorance of the rules is not an excuse for breaking them. The bylaws were provided to you at closing. It was your responsibility to read and understand them." "I understand that," I said, "but these rules seem designed to prevent disruptive or unsightly modifications to properties, not to penalize essential maintenance that every homeowner needs to do." "The rules are the rules," Harold chimed in. "If we make exceptions for one person, we have to make exceptions for everyone. Then what's the point of having an HOA?" "The point of having an HOA," I said, my frustration starting to show, "should be to maintain property values and ensure the neighborhood stays nice. Not to fine people for protecting their homes from winter damage." "The fine isn't for the winterization itself," Barbara said coldly. "It's for failing to follow proper procedure and for creating a noise disturbance. If you had filed the paperwork and scheduled the work during approved hours, there would be no fine." "What are approved hours?" I asked. "The bylaws just say noise can't exceed 75 decibels between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. on weekends, but a normal conversation is 60 decibels. A vacuum cleaner is 75. Lawn mowers are 90. If we're really enforcing 75 decibels as a hard limit, nobody could mow their lawn or use a leaf blower on Saturday morning." This caused some murmuring in the audience. I could see I had made a good point, and so could Barbara, because her expression hardened. "Nevertheless," she said, "you violated the advance notification requirement. That violation stands regardless of noise levels." The man in the polo shirt raised his hand tentatively. "Could we maybe waive the fine this time since Logan is new to the neighborhood and wasn't aware of the policy? Give him a warning instead." Barbara gave him a look that could have frozen lava. "Mr. Ortega has already received a warning, Doug. This is his second violation." "What?" I said. "No, it's not. This is the first time anyone from the HOA has contacted me about anything." Barbara pulled out another file. "On September 3rd, you received a warning for leaving your trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day." I stared at her. "That was a warning." "Some notice got stuck to my garage door. I thought it was an advertisement. It blew away before I could even read it properly." "Photographic evidence shows it was affixed to your garage at 7:42 a.m. on September 3rd, Barbara said. "You are required to check your property daily for HOA communications." "You can't be serious." "I'm quite serious. These rules exist for a reason, Mr. Ortega. This is your third violation, actually. The trash cans were the first warning. The unpermitted work and the noise violation count as second and third violations. According to our escalating penalty structure, the fines are appropriate." I looked at the other board members. Doug looked uncomfortable. The elderly woman was reading something on her phone. Harold looked smug. The young woman was staring at the ceiling. "This is insane," I said. "You're fining me $350 because a notice blew off my garage door and I hired someone to winterize my sprinklers." "We're fining you for repeated violations of clearly established rules," Barbara corrected. "The board will now deliberate." I was dismissed back to my seat. The board members huddled together, speaking in low voices. The whole deliberation took about 3 minutes before Barbara called me back up. "The board has voted 4-1 to uphold the fine," she announced. "Payment is due within 30 days. Next case." I stood there stunned. "Wait, that's it. No further discussion. The decision has been made." "Please sit down." I walked out of the community center in a daze. Doug caught up with me in the parking lot. "Hey, man, I'm sorry about that," he said. "I voted to waive it for what it's worth. Barbara's been on a rampage since she took over. She's fined half the neighborhood for something or other." "Can she do that?" "Just fine people at will," Doug shrugged. "According to the bylaws, yes. As long as the board votes to uphold the fines, they're enforceable. She's technically following the rules, even if she's being ridiculous about it. So I just have to pay $350. Or you can fight it in court, but that would cost you way more in legal fees. Most people just pay and try to stay off her radar." He glanced back at the community center. "Between you and me, there's a growing group of homeowners who want to recall her. But we need a petition signed by at least 30% of the residents, and a lot of people are scared of getting on her bad side." "I think I'm already on her bad side." Doug laughed, though it wasn't a happy sound. "Yeah, you definitely are. Just keep your head down and follow the rules to the letter from now on. File paperwork for everything, even if it seems stupid. And if you want to join the recall effort, let me know. We're meeting at my place next Wednesday." I took his number and drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. $350. It was the principle of the thing more than the money, though the money definitely stung. I had done nothing wrong. I had maintained my property responsibly. And I was being punished for it. The next morning, I woke up to find a new notice on my front door. This one was for my non-conforming mailbox, which was apparently not one of the 3 approved styles listed in the architectural guidelines. The mailbox had come with the house. It had been there for at least 10 years, according to my neighbors. But now, suddenly, it was a problem. The fine was $150, or I could replace the mailbox with an approved model within 30 days. That's when I decided to go to Doug's meeting. Wednesday evening, I drove to Doug's house in a different part of the subdivision. There were already a dozen people there, sitting in his living room and looking uniformly annoyed. Doug introduced me around. There was Maria, a single mom who had been fined for having her daughter's chalk drawings on the driveway. There was Robert, a retired veteran who had been cited for displaying an American flag in a manner that didn't conform to HOA standards, even though he was following the actual U.S. flag code. There was Jennifer, who had been fined for planting roses in her front yard without approval, even though roses were specifically listed as approved plants in the guidelines. Everyone had a story. Everyone had been fined. And everyone was fed up with Barbara Patterson. "She's raised over $20,000 in fines in the last 3 months, Doug said, pulling up a spreadsheet on his laptop. "That's more than the previous HOA board raised in 3 years, and it's all going into the HOA account which Barbara controls. What's she spending it on?" Maria asked. "That's the thing. Nothing. The money's just sitting there. She claims it's being saved for future common area improvements, but she won't give us specifics." "Can we see the financial records?" I asked. "We've requested them," Robert said. "She keeps delaying. Says she'll provide them at the annual meeting in January, but we're legally entitled to see them within 30 days of requesting them." This was starting to sound like more than just an overzealous HOA president. This was starting to sound like something shady. Jennifer, the rose planting woman, spoke up. My husband's a lawyer. He says we might have grounds for a lawsuit if she's violating the bylaws herself or misappropriating funds, but we'd need evidence. How do we get evidence if she won't hand over the financial records? Maria asked. We file a formal complaint with the state, Jennifer said. Colorado has laws governing HOAs. They're required to maintain transparency and operate within certain guidelines. If Barbara's violating those laws, the state can step in. This got everyone talking at once. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out a strategy. First, we would continue gathering signatures for the recall petition. Doug had 18% of the required signatures so far, so we needed to kick that into high gear. Second, Jennifer's husband would file a formal complaint with the Colorado Division of Real Estate, which oversees HOA regulations. Third, we would all start documenting every interaction with Barbara and the board, every fine, every violation notice, everything. I went home that night feeling better than I had in weeks. I wasn't alone in this. Barbara had overplayed her hand by going after so many people so aggressively. She had united the neighborhood against her. The next morning, I received yet another violation notice. This one was for my improperly maintained lawn, citing 3 dandelions visible from the street. The fine was $50. I took photos of the dandelions, documenting their exact location and size. Then I walked around the neighborhood taking photos of every other lawn within a 3-block radius. Barbara's lawn had at least a dozen dandelions. Harold's had visible crabgrass. The house directly across from mine had an entire patch of clover. I documented all of it, dated and time-stamped the photos, and sent them to Doug and Jennifer's husband. By the end of the week, I had received 2 more violation notices, one for my house numbers being insufficiently visible from the street, even though they were the same numbers that had been there for a decade, and one for having a non-conforming doormat. My doormat said, "Welcome" on it, which apparently violated some obscure rule about text on exterior decorations. I was up to over $600 in fines now, and I wasn't the only one. Barbara was blanketing the neighborhood with violations. Maria got cited for her porch light being the wrong color temperature. Robert got fined for his garage door being open for more than 10 minutes while he was unloading groceries. Jennifer got a second fine for not removing the non-approved roses fast enough. It was systematic harassment, and it was working. People were angry, but they were also scared. Nobody wanted to be the next target. The recall petition was moving slowly. A lot of people wanted to sign it, but they were afraid of retaliation. And Barbara had made it clear that she was watching everyone. She drove around the neighborhood constantly, clipboard in hand, looking for violations. She had recruited a few loyalists, including Harold, to help her patrol. Then, in mid-December, something interesting happened. Jennifer's husband, whose name was Mike, called an emergency meeting of the resistance group, as we had started calling ourselves. The state opened an investigation, he announced. They're looking into Barbara's financial management and whether she's following proper HOA procedures. They requested all financial records, meeting minutes, and documentation of violations and fines for the past year. We all cheered. Finally, someone with actual authority was paying attention. "There's more," Mike said. "I did some digging into Barbara's background. She was president of her previous HOA in Aurora before moving here. She resigned suddenly about 2 years ago. I reached out to some people in that community, and guess what? Same pattern. Aggressive fines, questionable financial management. They were in the process of investigating her when she resigned and moved." "So she's done this before," Doug said. "Looks like it." And here's the kicker. The Aurora HOA ended up having to hire a forensic accountant. They found that about $15,000 had gone missing. Barbara claimed it was for approved expenditures, but she couldn't provide adequate documentation. They were considering legal action when she left. The room went silent. This wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. This was potentially criminal. "We need to go to the police," Maria said. "Not yet," Mike cautioned. "We don't have proof she's stealing here. We have proof she did something questionable in another HOA. The state investigation needs to run its course. If they find evidence of financial impropriety, then we can bring in law enforcement." "How long will the state investigation take?" I asked. "Could be months. These things move slowly. But in the meantime, keep documenting everything. Every fine, every interaction, every violation notice. We're building a pattern of harassment." I went home that night and created a spreadsheet of all my violations and fines. Trash cans visible, warning. Unpermitted work, $250. Noise violation, $100. Non-conforming mailbox, $150. Dandelions, $50. House numbers, $75. Doormat, $50. Grand total, $675 plus the original warning. I hadn't paid any of it yet. Barbara had sent me increasingly threatening letters about collections and liens on my property. But Mike had advised all of us to hold off on paying until the state investigation concluded. If the fines were found to be unjustified, or if Barbara's authority was found to be compromised, we might be able to get them reversed. Christmas came and went. Barbara sent out a violation notice to 6 different houses for having their Christmas lights up past January 7th, as specified in the bylaws. She hit each house with a $100 fine. She also cited 3 families for having non-approved Christmas decorations, including one family whose only crime was having a 6-foot inflatable snowman in their front yard. The recall petition was now at 28%. We needed 30% to trigger a recall election. We were so close. In mid-January, the state investigator came to the neighborhood. She was a serious woman in her 40s named Linda Ross, and she spent 3 days reviewing records, interviewing board members, and talking to homeowners. I gave her my complete documentation, including photos, timestamps, copies of all violations, and my records from Doug's group showing the pattern of fines across the neighborhood. Barbara, meanwhile, was clearly panicking. She called an emergency board meeting and tried to get several violations dismissed or reduced, but it was too late. The evidence was already with the state. 2 weeks later, Linda Ross released her preliminary findings. The Division of Real Estate found that Barbara had 1. Issued fines that were excessive and inconsistent with the stated purpose of maintaining property values. 2. Failed to properly document and justify numerous expenditures from the HOA account. 3. Failed to provide financial transparency as required by Colorado law. 4. Violated proper procedures for board meetings and violation hearings. The state ordered an immediate audit of all HOA finances and suspended Barbara's authority to issue new fines pending the completion of the investigation. The neighborhood exploded with relief and vindication. People who had been living in fear of the next violation notice were finally able to breathe. The recall petition got the final signatures it needed within days, and a recall election was scheduled for February. But Barbara wasn't done yet. She showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening in late January, looking haggard and angry. "This is your fault," she said when I opened the door. "You couldn't just follow simple rules. You had to make a big deal out of everything." "You fined me $675 for having dandelions and the wrong doormat," I said. "Yeah, I made a big deal out of it, because it's insane. Those rules exist for a reason, to maintain standards, to keep property values high. No, I said. Those rules exist so you could go on a power trip and collect fines. The state found your financial records are a mess. Where's all that money going, Barbara? That's none of your business. Actually, it is. I live here. I pay HOA dues. That money belongs to the community, not to you. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to something almost threatening. You have no idea what you've done. When this all blows over, when I'm cleared of these ridiculous accusations, I'm going to make your life hell. I will find violations every single day. I will fine you for every little thing until you're forced to sell and leave. Are you threatening me? I'm promising you. She turned and walked away. I immediately called Mike and told him what had happened. He advised me to file a police report, which I did. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but said that unless Barbara actually did something illegal, there wasn't much they could do about threats. The audit results came back in early February. The forensic accountant found that approximately $32,000 had been diverted from the HOA account to personal accounts controlled by Barbara. She had disguised the transfers as payments to various vendors for landscaping, maintenance, and administrative services. But when the auditor contacted these vendors, they either didn't exist or reported providing far less service than the invoices claimed. In other words, Barbara had been stealing from the HOA. She had created fake invoices, paid herself through shell companies, and pocketed tens of thousands of dollars that should have been used for community maintenance and improvements. The Division of Real Estate referred the case to the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office. Within a week, detectives showed up in the neighborhood, interviewing board members and homeowners. Barbara hired a lawyer and stopped showing up at board meetings. The recall election happened on February 15th. Barbara was removed from the board by a vote of 87 to 12. Doug was elected as the new president. Jennifer and Maria joined the board as well. Their first act was to void all outstanding fines that had been issued since Barbara took office, pending individual review. My $675 in fines were wiped out completely. But the criminal case was just getting started. In March, Barbara was formally charged with theft, forgery, and embezzlement. The DA's office had traced the shell companies back to accounts Barbara controlled. They had also discovered that she had done something similar at the Aurora HOA, though on a smaller scale. That case had never been prosecuted because the Aurora HOA had opted to settle quietly when Barbara resigned and paid back some of the money. This time, there would be no quiet settlement. The Jefferson County DA was prosecuting aggressively, and the evidence was overwhelming. The trial took place in July. I attended several days of testimony. Barbara's lawyer tried to argue that the payments were legitimate, that she had provided administrative services worth the money she had taken. But the prosecution brought in expert witnesses who testified that the services Barbara claimed to have provided were either unnecessary or wildly overpriced. They showed that Barbara had issued hundreds of fines not to maintain community standards, but to generate revenue that she then diverted to her personal accounts. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Barbara guilty on all counts. Sentencing happened in August. The judge was clearly unimpressed with Barbara's arguments that she had worked hard for the community and deserved compensation for her time. He sentenced her to 3 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution of $32,000 to the HOA, plus court costs and penalties. Harold, her loyal lieutenant, was also charged as an accessory after investigators found that he had signed off on some of the fake invoices, though he claimed he didn't know they were fraudulent. He took a plea deal, received probation, and was banned from serving on any HOA board in Colorado for 10 years. By September, life in Meadowbrook Estates had returned to something resembling normal. Doug ran the HOA with a light touch, focusing on actual community needs like repairing the playground equipment and organizing neighborhood events. The board revised the bylaws to remove many of the petty restrictions Barbara had enforced so zealously. Doormats with text were now allowed. Mailboxes just had to be functional, not conforming to some approved aesthetic. Garden gnomes were permitted, as long as they weren't offensive. I finally got my sprinkler system winterized in October without incident. I filed the paperwork because it was still technically required, but Doug approved it within an hour via email and nobody said a word about noise levels. Tony from Colorado Springs Irrigation showed up on a Saturday morning, hooked up his compressor, and finished the job without anyone taking decibel readings or threatening fines. Standing in my front yard, watching the compressed air blow through the system, I felt a strange sense of victory. It was such a simple thing, such a routine piece of home maintenance, but it had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Barbara's reign of terror and everything that was now right with our neighborhood. Maria walked by with her daughter, who immediately started drawing a massive chalk mural on their driveway. Nobody complained. Robert had a massive American flag flying proudly from his porch, displayed according to proper flag code, but not according to Barbara's arbitrary restrictions. Nobody said a word. Jennifer's roses were blooming beautifully in her front yard, red and pink and yellow, adding color and life to the street. It turned out that when people weren't living in fear of fines and violations, they actually took better care of their properties. They took pride in their homes. They talked to their neighbors. They built a real community instead of a collection of houses ruled by fear. I ran into Doug at the mailbox a few days later. The mailbox I still hadn't replaced, the non-conforming one that had earned me a $150 fine in Barbara's world. "How's it going, Mr. President?" I asked. He laughed. "Surprisingly good. Turns out running an HOA is pretty easy when you're not trying to fine everyone for breathing wrong. Any news on Barbara?" She's appealing the sentence, but her lawyer says it's unlikely to go anywhere. The evidence was too strong. He paused. "You know, in a weird way, I almost feel bad for her. She must have been really unhappy to do all that." "She threatened to make my life hell," I reminded him. "She stole from all of us. She terrorized the entire neighborhood." "I know, you're right. I guess I just can't imagine being that miserable that you'd turn into that kind of person." I thought about that as I walked back to my house. Barbara had been in a position of power, but instead of using it to help people, she had used it to control and intimidate them. She had seen the HOA not as a tool for maintaining a community, but as a personal fiefdom where she could exercise authority and enrich herself. And it had all started because I needed to winterize my sprinklers. That evening, I got an email from the HOA. It was a newsletter, something Doug had started sending out monthly to keep everyone informed about what was going on. This month's edition included updates on the playground renovation, a reminder about the upcoming Halloween decoration contest, which Barbara would have hated, and a note that all homeowners were entitled to a partial refund of their HOA dues since the recovered money from Barbara's restitution payments was being returned to the community. My share came out to about $400. Not enough to compensate for the stress and hassle of the past year, but a nice, symbolic gesture nonetheless. The newsletter also included a section called Know Your Rights, written by Mike, Jennifer's lawyer husband. It explained the limits of HOA authority, the homeowner's right to appeal decisions, and how to recognize warning signs of HOA abuse. It was information that everyone should have known from the start, but that most of us, myself included, had ignored until it was too late. I printed it out and put it in a folder with all my documentation from the Barbara era. Not because I expected to need it again, but as a reminder to stay informed, to pay attention, to not assume that people in authority positions will always act in good faith. November rolled around, and I finally got around to replacing my doormat. Not because anyone made me, but because the old one was worn out. I bought a new one that said, "Come back with a warrant," as a joke. Doug saw it when he stopped by to drop off some paperwork and laughed so hard he almost cried. "Barbara would have lost her mind over that," he said. "That's why I bought it," I replied. He grinned. "You know, you should run for the board next year. We could use someone with your attitude." My attitude got me fined $675. Your attitude also brought down a tyrant and exposed a thief. I'd say that's a pretty good attitude. I thought about it. A year ago, I had wanted nothing to do with the HOA. I had wanted to just live my life, maintain my house, and be left alone. But Barbara had made that impossible, and in fighting back, I had learned something important. Communities only work when people participate, pay attention, and hold leaders accountable. "Maybe," I said. "Let me think about it." Doug left, and I went back inside where my house was warm and comfortable and mine. My sprinklers were winterized and ready for the cold months ahead. My lawn had a few dandelions, which I had decided were actually kind of pretty. My mailbox was non-conforming and probably always would be. My doormat was definitely a violation of at least 3 of Barbara's old rules, and I had never been happier. The following week, I got a call from a reporter at the Denver Post. She was writing a story about HOA abuse and had heard about the Barbara Patterson case. She wanted to interview some of the homeowners who had been affected. I agreed to talk to her. We met at a coffee shop in Lakewood, and I told her the whole story, from the sprinkler winterization that started it all to the trial and conviction. She took notes furiously, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. "This is incredible," she said. "I've covered a lot of HOA stories, but this is one of the worst cases I've heard of." "Really?" I said. "I figured this kind of thing happened all the time." "HOA overreach happens constantly," she agreed. "But actual criminal embezzlement, that's rarer. And the fact that she'd done it before and gotten away with it, that's the angle I want to focus on. How was she able to move to a new HOA and do the same thing?" "Nobody checked her background," I said. "The previous board was retiring, and she seemed organized and willing to take on the job. They didn't think to ask if she had been president of another HOA or why she left." "That's a systemic problem," the reporter said. "There's no database of HOA board members, no background check requirement, no accountability across communities. Someone can wreak havoc in one place, move 10 miles away, and start over." The article ran a few weeks later. It was titled, "How a Lakewood HOA President Embezzled Thousands While Terrorizing Homeowners." It was well written and fair, laying out the facts without sensationalizing them. It quoted me, Doug, Maria, and several others. It included Barbara's mugshot and details of her conviction. And it ended with a call for better oversight and regulation of HOAs in Colorado. The article got picked up by other news outlets. I did a couple of radio interviews. A local TV station came out to film a segment in our neighborhood, with Doug explaining the reforms the board had implemented. For a few weeks, Meadowbrook Estates was the poster child for HOA reform in Colorado. Then, predictably, the attention faded. The news cycle moved on. but the changes we had made stuck. Our HOA was functioning the way it was supposed to, maintaining common areas, enforcing genuinely important rules about safety and property maintenance, and otherwise leaving people alone to live their lives. In December, almost exactly a year after the whole ordeal had started with Barbara's decibel meter and clipboard, I got a holiday card from Tony at Colorado Springs Irrigation. Inside, he had written, "Hope this year's winterization was less eventful. Happy holidays." I laughed and put the card on my refrigerator. This year's winterization had indeed been uneventful. No threats, no fines, no drama. Just a guy doing his job, protecting my house from winter weather, exactly the way it should be. I also got a card from Doug, thanking me for my service to the community and again encouraging me to run for the board. I was actually considering it now. Not because I wanted power or authority, but because I had learned that sometimes the best people for leadership positions are the ones who don't particularly want them, but understand their responsibility to participate. On Christmas Eve, I was putting up lights on my house after December 15th, which was now the HOA-approved date, though nobody was checking very closely, when a car pulled up and a woman I didn't recognize got out. "Are you Logan Ortega?" she asked. "Yes, I'm Sandra Mills. I live over in Riverside Acres, about 2 miles from here. I read the article about your HOA situation, and I think we're going through something similar. Our new HOA president has been issuing all these fines for ridiculous things, and nobody knows what to do. I was hoping you could give me some advice." I climbed down from my ladder and invited her inside. Over coffee, she told me a story that sounded eerily familiar. A new HOA president who had taken over a few months ago, aggressive enforcement of petty rules, fines for minor violations, and a growing sense of frustration and helplessness among homeowners. I gave her Mike's contact information and told her everything we had done, documenting violations, filing complaints with the state, organizing a recall effort. I showed her my spreadsheet of fines and violations, my photos of dandelions and mailboxes and doormats. I walked her through the whole process. "The key is documentation and solidarity," I said. "Get as many homeowners involved as possible. Don't let people fight alone. And don't be afraid to escalate to the state or even law enforcement if you suspect something criminal is going on." Sandra left with pages of notes and a determined look on her face. A week later, she emailed to say she had organized a meeting of concerned homeowners and that they were starting their own resistance movement. I realized then that the Barbara Patterson saga wasn't just about one bad HOA president in one neighborhood. It was about a systemic issue that affected thousands of communities across America. HOAs had been created with good intentions to maintain property values and manage shared resources. But too often, they became vehicles for petty tyrants to exercise power over their neighbors, or worse, to enrich themselves at the community's expense. And the only way to fight back was for regular people to pay attention, get involved, and refuse to be intimidated. In January, the 1-year anniversary of the state investigation's start, our HOA held its annual meeting. Over 100 people showed up, compared to the 15 or 20 who had attended in previous years. Doug gave a report on the state of the community, the finances, which were now transparent and available for anyone to review online, and the plans for the coming year. Then he opened the floor for new business. I stood up. "I'd like to nominate myself for the board," I said. There was applause. Doug grinned. Maria and Jennifer, who were both up for re-election, nodded approvingly. "Any objections?" Doug asked the room. Silence. Hearing none, Logan Ortega is nominated for the board. Any other nominations? 3 other people nominated themselves. We held an election right there by paper ballot, the way it was supposed to be done. All 4 of us were elected. The board was now 7 people, all committed to running the HOA with transparency, fairness, and common sense. After the meeting, as people were filing out, Robert came up to me. The veteran with the American flag. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not backing down, for fighting back. A lot of us wanted to, but we didn't know how. You showed us it was possible." "I just wanted to winterize my sprinklers," I said. He laughed. "And look what happened. You took down a criminal and reformed an HOA. Not bad for a sprinkler winterization." Driving home that night, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. It had started with something so mundane, so routine, protecting my home's irrigation system from freezing temperatures. But Barbara's overreaction had set off a chain of events that exposed corruption, united a community, and ultimately made the neighborhood a better place to live. I parked in my driveway. Overnight parking was now allowed. Walked past my non-conforming mailbox and my sarcastic doormat, and went inside my house. My house, with its 3 dandelions and its improper house numbers, and its history of excessive noise violations for essential maintenance. I had won. We had all won. Not just against Barbara, but against the mindset that rules matter more than people, that conformity matters more than community, that power exists to be wielded rather than to serve. And if my sprinkler system needed winterizing again next fall, I would file the paperwork because it was a reasonable request. And then I would schedule Tony to show up on Saturday morning with his loud compressor. And I would stand in my front yard watching the water blast out of the sprinkler heads, and I would smile. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary act is simply insisting on doing routine home maintenance without being harassed, fined, and threatened. Sometimes, freedom sounds like a compressor running at 85 decibels on a Saturday morning. And sometimes, justice looks like a woman in an orange jumpsuit serving 3 years for stealing from her neighbors while pretending to protect property values. I poured myself a beer, sat down on my couch, and opened my laptop to check the HOA board's shared calendar. We had our first official board meeting scheduled for next week. I needed to review the agenda, which included discussions about repaving the community center parking lot, organizing a neighborhood watch program, and reviewing a request from a homeowner who wanted to install solar panels. All normal stuff. All reasonable stuff. All the things an HOA was supposed to handle. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Doug. "Welcome to the board. Fair warning, it's mostly arguing about landscaping contractors and updating the website. Way more boring than taking down embezzlers." I texted back. Boring sounds perfect. And it did. After a year of drama, conflict, and criminal investigations, boring sounded absolutely perfect. Outside my window, I could see lights on in houses all up and down the street. Families settling in for the evening, living their lives without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment. The neighborhood looked peaceful, normal, and safe. That's what an HOA was supposed to provide. A framework for people to live together harmoniously, maintaining their homes and their community. Not a weapon for control freaks and criminals to terrorize their neighbors. We had learned that lesson the hard way, but we had learned it. And now, as I sat there planning for my first board meeting, reviewing requests and proposals and mundane administrative tasks, I felt something I hadn't felt since moving to Meadowbrook Estates over a year ago. I felt at home, not just in my house, but in my community. In a place where people looked out for each other, where leaders served rather than ruled, where you could winterize your sprinklers on a Saturday morning without fear of retribution. It had been a long, strange journey from that October morning when Barbara Patterson marched across the street with her clipboard and her attitude. But we had made it through. We had survived, adapted, and come out stronger. And when next October rolled around, I would winterize my sprinklers again. Maybe I would even invite the whole board over to watch, just for the irony of it. We could make a party out of it. Celebrate the anniversary of the incident that started everything, but probably not. That would be weird. Instead, I would just file my paperwork, schedule Tony, and get the job done. Like a normal person in a normal neighborhood with a normal HOA that functioned the way it was supposed to. Because in the end, that's all any of us wanted. To be normal, to be left alone to live our lives, and to have leaders who understood that their job was to facilitate that, not to prevent it. The story of my year-long battle with the HOA was over. The story of being a productive member of that HOA, helping to run it fairly and sensibly, was just beginning. And honestly, I was looking forward to it, even if it meant occasionally dealing with disputes about mailboxes and doormats and dandelions. At least now, I would be on the side making sure those disputes were handled reasonably, proportionally, and with respect for the homeowners involved. That felt like a good place to be. I finished my beer, closed my laptop, and headed to bed. Tomorrow was Saturday. I had some yard work to do. Maybe I would let a few more dandelions grow, just because I could. Just because, in this neighborhood, in this community that we had fought for and won back from tyranny, a few dandelions in the lawn were no longer a crime punishable by fine. They were just dandelions. And that was exactly how it should be.